You ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, well, welcome to the Democratic Teaching and Learning webinar series presented by the Committee of Participedia that focuses on teaching and learning. We are the mentorship training, teaching, and mentorship committee of Participedia.net, and we're really pleased to be able to bring together some of the researchers and collaborators who are involved with Participedia, and those of you whose work intersects with this project. The series is really intended to provide a format for talking about challenges and successes in the field of teaching methods, cases, and theories that support democratic participation. So I'll just flip the next slide. We've got Jesse Carthen on the controls. So welcome to the session. My name is Joanna Ashworth. I'm with Simon Fraser University. I'm in the Faculty of Environment, and my work at the university involves, as well as developing programs for professionals in the environment field. I'm involved with a program called the Certificate in Dialogue and Civic Engagement, a program I started about 10 years ago at the university. So I've been very interested in civic engagement and teaching and training in this area for a number of years. So I'm really pleased to be working with others on Participedia, and particularly interested in the topic today. And before we get started, I'll just share a little bit about Participedia for those of you who are new to the network. Participedia, as you may know, is a global community sharing knowledge and stories about public participation. We basically have a web platform and quite a new version of it, Participedia XYZ, that is where we house cases, methods, and organizations from both our partners. We have a network of 30 plus universities, plus 5 NGOs and numerous organizations who are involved in contributing knowledge to the site, as well as consuming the knowledge, using it for teaching and learning purposes. So it's an exciting project. As you can see from the website, we've got all range of cases, from participatory budgeting to women's forums in developing countries, recent events in Citizens Assembly, so a whole range. And many of you on the call will have probably already had a chance to scroll through or also contribute to the work that's up there. The project goals are really, well, I'll talk about the research question, the big organizing question of this project. And I'll just say that the two leads are Mark Warren from UBC and Arkon Fung from Harvard. And this is a project funded by SSHRC, the Canadian Social Science Research Center. And the question that is organizing this work is what kinds of participatory democratic innovations work best for specific purposes and under what conditions. And this guiding question is something that is an ongoing exploration as we aggregate the cases. The analysis of those cases is ongoing. The project goals are really to map democratic innovations, to try to explain how and why they're having an impact, assess their contribution, look at how knowledge can be transferred into practice, and in doing so, develop a new model of collaboration in social science. So it's an exciting project. I can't tell you how many entries there actually are on the site, but you're certainly welcome to it, because they're changing and growing every day. There's also some other parts of the project, including a survey instrument, which is looking at gathering in a systematic way the case information, and a new contribution which is called Dataverse. If you take a look at it, it's a place where it's a home for data sets that graduate and postgraduate students' dissertations are housed, practitioners' reports and evaluations. It's a place where any researcher can access for large data sets in the field. So, and it's an exciting contribution, a newer contribution that the project is recently forming. So welcome everybody. If you're just joining, please feel free to introduce yourselves on the chat. The chat function's at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our two presenters, Tim Shaffer from Kansas State University and Bettina von Lieres from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. And I'll just introduce them both for you, and then Tim will take it from there, followed by Bettina. And I think what's exciting about having Tim and Bettina and Tim share their experiences on democratic pedagogy and schools of thought, both in Canada, US, the UK, and beyond, is that they're both scholars and in many ways practitioners. They work in bringing these theories and ideas to the teaching that they do, and their scholarship is also in the field of democratic pedagogy. So we're really pleased to have both of them today. I think we're going to have a great conversation. I'll introduce you to Bettina first. She's an assistant professor in the teaching stream in the Center for Critical Development Studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough in Canada, where she teaches courses on critical citizenship studies. She's held positions in South Africa in 1991 to 2002, and in 2002 to 2011 she participated as a lead researcher in the Development Research Center for Citizenship, Participation and Accountability, which was hosted at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. She's led several global partnerships that bring together researchers, practitioners, and educators from the Global South and the North. And she's currently also appointed as an extraordinary senior researcher at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. She's got several publications. I probably won't list them now, but I think they are also listed on your presentation. But just to mention, Mediated Citizenship, The Informal Politics of Speaking for Citizens in the Global South, which was co-edited by Lawrence Piper and published by Palgrave. So Bettina, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. And Tim Shaffer is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies and assistant director at the Institute of Civic Discourse and Democracy at Kansas State University. He's a principal researcher specialist with the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona and associate editor of the Journal of Public Deliberation. So Tim, it centers his research on the advancement of democratic practices through deliberative politics and civic engagement in higher education and other institutional and community settings. And he's published as well numerous articles and book chapters. And I'll just mention the most recent, the co-editor of the Deliberative Pedagogy, Teaching and Learning for Democratic Engagement, that was published most recently by Michigan State University. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it now over to Tim, and Tim's going to spend about 15 minutes in presentation, followed by Bettina, and then I'll be monitoring any questions that you have as you introduce yourselves, and then we'll dip into those questions and try our best to have probably not the most fulsome conversation, but certainly Bettina and Tim will do their best to address some of the questions that arise as you hear their presentation. So Tim, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I appreciate this chance. And as I'm watching some of the names in the chat box, I'm trying not to get too distracted, but I saw Oliver Escobar chime in there. You might see a slide that looks like something from your 2011 publication. So be ready for that. So I think I've got control here. There we go. So I wanted to, now it's jumping. I apologize. So I really wanted to start here with a little bit of a framing. As was mentioned just a moment ago, one of the recent publications and projects that I've been involved with for quite a few years is around this notion of deliberative pedagogy. And I'll explain that a little bit more as I go on. But really rooting this idea for those of us who are in a whole variety of educational settings, whether it's in higher ed classrooms or if it's community-based environments, in cooperative education, whatever it might be, experiential education, really how do we think about the work of participation and engagement showing up in these educational spaces? And how do we bridge that with the idea of developmental thinking kind of maturing in our understandings of what it means to be a citizen, a member of a community, as well, and which for me really leads us into this idea of how do we bridge all of these participatory democratic practices with how we're living in and with communities for this larger sense of kind of democratic life. So that's kind of where I'm going to be starting for some of this conversation. But the first thing I want to put here, it might seem a little bit odd, kind of a strange question, but do you view your work as a carpenter or as a gardener? And I've used this question as a prompt for some recent workshops with people who are interested in experiential education, service learning, some of these spaces. And what I mean by this question, and I encourage you to think about this, and maybe we can come back to some of this at the end in the Q&A. But for me, there are a couple of different ways that most of us who are showing up on this webinar probably think of the work that we do. We're probably concerned and care about people being included, being able to hear voices, helping people engage in certain processes, and then in some significant ways, being able to shape what is going on, to have a sense of ownership. And the reason I use these kind of categories is that in some ways we can be a carpenter. We might want to follow some pretty expected guidelines, right? You want to make those measurements and cuts accurately, or else the thing's not going to work. So even though we might have, or the desire for some flexibility, we still might be operating in these kind of expected paradigms. In contrast to a gardener, which, even though you also still need to know the pH of the soil and know what you're doing, there's something a little different about it, because you're helping to shape something, you're giving a little bit of life to it, you're helping to cultivate. But in fact, what happens goes above and beyond your control in some significant ways. And so as we think about the intersection of participation and engagement with teaching and learning, how do we approach those spaces, whether it's in classrooms or if it's in community settings, and what are those implications, not only for those that we're interacting with, but also for ourselves as professionals? So building from that, what is this deliberative pedagogy work? For me, and as this work was alluded to a moment ago, a lot of it has been captured in this volume that we published last year called Deliberative Pedagogy, Teaching and Learning for Democratic Engagement. And a few points I want to make first, right? That this is really rooted in these democratic and deliberative theories. So I don't want to be dismissive of that. But in contrast to thinking of these community settings, where we're really thinking about participatory and deliberative approaches, this deliberative pedagogy idea integrates those notions of decision-making with our educational concerns, right? So our teaching, our learning, and our engagement, and as I alluded to, in these settings, both in classrooms and in communities. So to flesh that out just a little bit more, right? It's this really deeply educational process. And I don't want to present this in a way that nothing else has obviously been done in this realm. Some significant work, and as I see some of the names in the chat boxes, I recognize them as some significant scholars in these areas. But what we are arguing here is that we're really encouraging and trying to give some language and some frameworks to thinking of how do you create space to consider, to weigh those tensions and trade-offs, those multiple perspectives that could lead us to action through a process of what we call kind of informed judgment or public judgment, borrowing some of that language from Dan Yankelovich and others. It's simultaneously a way of teaching that is itself deliberative, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. That we are not only teaching about, but we're also practicing these things. And then, as I say here, maybe most importantly, the work of this deliberative pedagogy is about space making. How do we create and hold space for authentic, productive dialogue, for these conversations that are not only informative and educational, but have the opportunity and the chance to be transformative. So if Escobar is still on the webinar, this is pulling from his 2011 publication on public dialogue and deliberation, because and I use this quite often with citation, I should note. But what's really helpful here is distinguishing some of the different ways we might think about this broad category of kind of dialogue and deliberation. And I'll use these sometimes interchangeably in popular ways, but there's a helpfulness to offer some distinctions. And as you see on the bottom there, the idea of deliberation really is this notion of how are we weighing how are we considering thoughtfully and intentionally multiple perspectives and vantage points, which is a little different from, say, conversation or discussion, which sometimes can be a little bit more informal or maybe unstructured. So just to note that when I'm using deliberative pedagogy, I really am primarily thinking of it through that lens of this idea of how do we weigh those tensions, those trade-offs, the different perspectives in some significant ways. So it shows up in all sorts of situations for me in classroom settings, where they're teaching and learning about this, and then when students, undergraduate and graduate as well, will design discussion resources and materials, as well as facilitate conversations about a whole host of topics. And so what you're seeing here is in fact about the issue of gun safety, which is somewhat of a unique American experience, but the state where I am based, the state of Kansas, passed a law a number of years ago that permitted the carrying of concealed handguns on college campuses. And so we were having discussions about that, and which was a significant thing because there were some implications, some significant implications on what that meant for opportunities for learning in classrooms as well as living environments and other spaces. And so students really stepped into that, but only after being kind of rooted and trained in some of these ideas and approaches. So one example that really shows up in some of the work that I have done in recent years. I include here from Sam Kainer this image, if you've seen this other places, this idea of the groan zone. It really is, how do we move from, as he points to on the left side of the screen, the idea of kind of business as usual, and then all of a sudden when we say, we want to talk about this, or we want to have some exploratory discussion, we need to consider lots of perspectives, brainstorming. How do we move from that, the space where we have some divergent ideas, and before we get back to a convergence of agreement, there's what he calls this groan zone, right? Which is literally the, oh gosh, I don't know if this is going to come through, if this is going to happen. And it's a significant thing for those of you who work in community settings. You often know this, and also in classrooms as well. But it's getting over the hump. It's getting kind of through some of those paradigms. In our deliberative pedagogy volume, a colleague, Martine Carcassonne at Colorado State University, really uses the Kainer model quite a bit and thinks through that kind of language to think about what is that connection to deliberative pedagogy, right? So you start to think about the notion of divergent thinking, and for a lot of us using the language of kind of working through these public problems before we get to a place where we can maybe come to agreement. That's not always the case, right? But thinking about that as at three levels: conceptually, also thinking about it at that individual level, those kinds of skills, and then also what are those larger capacities or needs that might need to happen, right? So whether we're thinking at a community or organizational level, all of these pieces are really significant, and we can replicate this and see this happening in classrooms and lots of educational environments as well. So quite helpful, I think, in some significant ways. This may be more difficult to read depending on the size of your screen, but some other colleagues, and I saw Oliver chime in there again, Sarah Drury and some other colleagues who also contributed to the deliberative pedagogy book, really helped to think through some of what they call these learning outcomes, this rubric. And I find this to be tremendously helpful. So what are the things that we aspire to when we're trying to teach about deliberative pedagogy and participation? Things like collaboration, reason giving, reflection, awareness of relationships, empathy, and so on. But what you see here is the idea that there are, again, here's this developmental model. For those who are stepping in for the first time or early on in these kinds of conversations or processes, how do you move from that sense of self and just that self-awareness to really moving on and developing into this larger kind of larger vision of what this work is? And so if for no other reason, I think this rubric is probably one of those gems in that volume, and is a great resource for people who are thinking about this. And so if you're not inclined to grab the book, I'd be happy to just send this to you. But because I think it is just so helpful, I keep it tacked up on my wall as I'm structuring classroom experience as well as communities. Right. So this leads me to this: teaching beyond teaching about. Right. So a publication a few years ago that I wrote more about my own experience of some of this was called Teaching Deliberative Democracy Deliberatively. And it gets at that idea that this is not just the content that we want to have be course material for discussion and that we're practicing, and in fact we are doing it ourselves. We're co-creating the structure, our syllabus, these kinds of opportunities, which is going to look differently for lots of people, but it is a significant thing, right? And then this idea of deliberative pedagogy being an essential component of the future of teaching and learning, especially when we think about the civic purpose. I know here in the United States, there are a number of organizations like Campus Compact and others who are really committed to this idea of how do we think about the civic aspirations and goals of the work of colleges and universities. This is one of those ways to really attend to that. And then for me personally, I ground a lot of this in civic studies. People like Harry Boyd and Peter Levine and others who have helped shape that field, kind of this nascent field. But what helps me and makes some sense of this work that I've been describing is that civic studies attends to concerns about factual information, also recognizing that people are coming with many different values and beliefs about the shared concern, and then that third question of what do we do, the strategies. And so I mention this because I think the volume itself, the deliberative pedagogy volume, really brought together people from lots of different disciplines. And so we weren't all sharing a common language, but one of the things somewhat we brought into there, and that I do, especially in my work, is grounding it in some of these larger frameworks. So that civic mission language, some of what shows up in the field of civic studies, the complementary dimensions of facts, values, and strategies. And then just one of the last pieces I want to mention here is for us. Those of us who show up on a webinar call on a Wednesday, right? We are fundamentally civic professionals because we take seriously the work that we're doing in our teaching and research and trying to have impact, right? So how do we conceptualize of ourselves as these professionals who, it has a significant impact on how we engage others. And so just to attend to that. And if we take seriously the challenge of engagement, and particularly using processes like deliberation, for example, and significantly in these times that are so dramatically polarized in some really significant ways, we need to rethink what it means to integrate or to embed some of this deliberative dialogue into our work. And so the last reference that I'll point to here is truly the most recent thing that has been published that I'm connected with just days ago, is a small volume of practitioner profiles called Jumping into Civic Life. And it mostly through the cooperative extension system here in the United States, but a tremendous resource because it's people sharing how they've come to and approach their work with deep commitments to citizen-centered politics, and then using these deliberative and dialogic approaches in what they're doing. So I look forward to some more conversation towards the end, and really looking forward to hearing the next presenter. So I think we're going to do the transition of the clicker. It may have just happened. Technology is amazing.
Thank you very much. Yes. So we'll look for questions and comments arising from your presentation. That was really excellent. And now I'd love to pass the baton over to Bettina von Lieres. So looking forward to hearing from you, Bettina.
Hi, everybody. I'm just trying to get going on the slides. I can't seem to move them, Jesse.
There's a bit of a lag, so be careful. It'll start flying.
Okay. Oh, all right. Okay. Okay. I'll go back. Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Bettina von Lieres, and I teach in the International Development Studies program at the University of Toronto. I think the focus of my contribution is slightly different. I mainly research democratic citizenship in the global South, with a focus on South Africa. So most of my teaching experience has actually been in South Africa, but also teaching in a program for international development studies. The focus is largely on contexts in the global South. So, and really the focus of a lot of my teaching is on how to understand inclusive citizenship. And most of my research is really on the politics of citizenship in the global South. I'm the co-founder of a network, a research network, which largely includes researchers from the Global South. It's called the Collaboration for Research on Democracy. It's about 5 years old. And we bring together academics, practitioners, activists, mainly from the Global South, to think about democracy building and the current challenges. But there's a strong focus in our network on researching and teaching inclusive citizenship. So I guess I want to speak a bit about why does teaching democratic citizenship matter? It matters for us and the group of researchers that I work with because of what we perceive as the closing down of civil society globally. Today, the outlook for civil society remains very worrying. Large numbers of states and non-state actors continue to violate the basic norms of international law by disrupting people's ability to form democratic organizations and to hold their states accountable. And more than ever, in my field at least, there's a need to really strengthen the capacity of communities, especially marginalized communities, to act for democratic citizenship in order to hold states accountable. So we're really grappling with the question of democratic citizenship in the context of how to hold states accountable and respond to the needs of citizens. My approach in teaching citizenship in classes in South Africa, but also here in Canada, is really focused on two ideas. Power, right? So we really focus in our classes on understanding citizenship through the lens of power, how wider power structures and processes like states, inequality, marginalization, histories of colonialism reproduce marginalization and differentiated citizenship. But we also have a focus in our courses on resistance and the role of resistance in shaping people's experiences and capacities to act democratically as citizens. And really, I use the term resistance because it's really, it's sort of a term in my field, but, we can also speak about citizen action and citizen mobilization as important in understanding democratic citizenship. Now, I just want to give a quote by John Gaventa, who is the research director of the Institute of Development Studies, who argues that one of the priorities for development in 2018 is to keep democratic spaces open so that citizens can hold their governments accountable, express their voices, and deepen democratic participation. And I would add that one of the priorities for development is to build citizens' capacities for democratic citizenship in order to hold their states accountable. Most of my work focuses on South Africa, my research. I just want to say a few things about my research because the context does matter and it has shaped how I view pedagogies, democratic pedagogies for inclusive citizenship. So, everybody will be familiar with Cape Town's water crisis. But I think what's really interesting about the water crisis, in addition to, the environmental issues and policy challenges, is really how the water crisis speaks to deep histories of inequality in Cape Town and in many contexts in the Global South. And these histories of inequality are also histories of material indignity. I work with a group of researchers who have worked on citizens' protests around sanitation issues in Cape Town. And we're really working with the idea that, most people in the world experience in their everyday lives deep material indignities. They cannot access social services. They do not receive any social welfare. And that these experiences of material indignity profoundly shape how they view citizenship and how they experience citizenship. And so I think it's important that the contextual dimension of how people in the world experience citizenship is one that I also really try and bring into my teaching in the classroom. I use the work of quite a few post-colonial scholars. Partha Chatterjey's work has influenced me and my cohort of researchers a lot. You know, the idea that states in the global south view some people as citizens, but others simply as populations to be managed technocratically. But really this idea that citizenship is not simply a legal, juridico category, but it's really a deep, also experiential category, and that most people in the world experience citizenship really in very exclusionary terms. Okay, now what does all of this mean for how I teach democratic citizenship? I'm going to go on to another slide. So I think my starting point in the classroom, both in South Africa and here in Toronto, is to really position students as meaningful collaborators in knowledge construction. So the idea that students are active citizens in the classroom, but also are meaningful contributors to thinking about democratic citizenship. So I understand the classroom as a site of citizenship learning, and I'm particularly interested in silent citizenship in the classroom. You know, there are many students are often very silent in the classroom, and I've been working a lot with participatory techniques. But I found that, you know, a lot of participatory approaches to pedagogy in the classroom do not often really deepen or produce student voice. So I'm quite concerned in my teaching also with the limits of participatory pedagogies in the classroom. And we've been grappling, especially with my cohort of colleagues in Toronto, about how to really build student voice in the classroom. We use a number of, you know, participatory exercises to facilitate peer learning, walk and talks, you know, asking students to really share their own experiences about citizenship with each other, bringing objects of citizenship into the classroom, but really, really encouraging students to develop their own voice in talking about citizenship. And that's not always easy. I also think it's important to think about myself in terms of democratic and feminist pedagogies. I talk a lot about my own positionality in the classroom. And we spend a lot of time with students in the classroom linking their everyday experiences of citizenship with wider issues and ideas about power, about authority and intersectionality. And this is particularly important in teaching citizenship in classrooms in South Africa, where students' experience of racism and exclusion and inequality still deeply shapes how they feel they are able to participate in an equal way in the classroom. And it becomes very important with students to really surface their past experiences with power, authority, and intersectionality. There's a strong emphasis in my classrooms on experiential learning, an exercise I often use, and I actually got this exercise from John Gaventa as part of the citizenship program that I was part of when I worked with his IDS network, his Institute of Development Studies network at Sussex. An experiential exercise that seems to work quite well in the classroom is to ask students to discuss moments in their life where they have felt most and least like a citizen. And this exercise often produces a lot of discussion about students' everyday experience of inclusive and exclusive citizenship. And it's a really powerful exercise that I've really used for many years. I link my students up with development practitioners who work in the area of citizenship. I collaborate, for example, with the Coady Institute program, the Women's Empowerment Program, to bring women practitioners, mainly from the Global South, into my classrooms so that they can share their experiences of working with communities and citizens in their own contexts. Students find the engagement with practitioners who work in the area of citizenship and democratic citizenship very useful. And here the attempt is to really link theories of citizenship with practitioners and policymakers who've worked for long periods of time in the field and really understand the politics of citizenship so that we can engage theories from a practice standpoint. And I just want to end off by talking about a recent initiative that we've started. So we are at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, really interested in building global classrooms. So we have an event every year where we connect our classroom in Toronto with classrooms in Cape Town and Johannesburg using Zoom technology for a 2-hour dialogue on experiences of citizenship. And the students get very, very excited, especially when they start talking about their everyday experiences of citizenship. At the moment, the classrooms in Cape Town and Johannesburg have a lot of students from other parts of Africa who are sharing their experiences of citizenship through their experiences at the borders, for example, between Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. So there's some really interesting discussions that occur between the students in real time about their everyday experiences in very different contexts, especially contexts that cut across the North and the South. I think that's all. Thank you, Joanna. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. So lots to think about and talk about now. And now it's the opportunity to return to those of you who have been silent and find a way to bring your voices out, to bring your expertise to the fore and ask some questions. I think we've heard from Tim about both the practice of democratic pedagogy, the work that he's doing, and the scholarship, and then Bettina talking about what it means to be a citizen. And in fact, that experiential exercise that you offered, or that you presented here, I recently was in a classroom of teachers, and I invited them to consider that for themselves, and then as they think about their own students. I mean, there's just an amazing ripple effect when you bring experiential learning into a classroom setting. It's really very meaningful. But I also take your point about the limits of participation, and sometimes students coming in because of their own histories are very reluctant to trust a process in which they're invited to do group work or other some of our more well used and well recognized forms of participation. Maybe we need to get a little more experimental and more experiential. So I'm going to put it out to you. If you could type in your question, then I will raise that up to both Tim and Bettina. Or if you want to make a comment or share something that you're doing that these presentations have resonated for you. Oh, and here we go. Here's a question from Oliver about facilitation skills. Are they also included in your approaches? That is, students getting the opportunity to develop their approach to facilitating dialogue and deliberation. Maybe Tim, you want to take that? I think you mentioned something about that, and of course, Bettina.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great question, and thanks for that. In fact, last night I was teaching a graduate seminar on deliberation theory, and actually, in fact, built into a class on theory, we are going to do some deliberative dialogue forum work, and that's going to happen later. In virtually every course I'm teaching this semester, every course this semester has some deliberative dialogue component built in, where they do quite a bit of practice and learning of facilitation skills in the classroom, and then also by participating in some of those before they actually step into a role of facilitating. Some institutions have phenomenal programs of student facilitators that extend multi-years, co-curricular and curricular. But the short answer is that I do build in those facilitation skills, because it's one thing to just kind of talk about this in a conceptual or theoretical way, and it's another to actually experience it, right? To be in spaces when you're thinking about who's around the table, what voices are being heard. So all the way from figuring out what are the best locations and times, whether you're trying to do something on a college campus or in a community. So the very logistical, practical kind of pieces, as well as truly the heart of it, which is the facilitation of these discussions. And And what I have found is that students across disciplines, I end up teaching people from lots of different fields, that they find application and usefulness in a whole variety of realms, right? So it's not just for those who are interested in the civic kind of dialogue discussion work, but it's also showing up in people who are stepping into organizations or even corporations, if they're educators and the like. And so the facilitation skills are, I think, part and parcel. And if they're not, then we should probably really rethink how and why we're teaching. If we're saying what we're doing is this democratic engagement, and particularly this deliberative engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Bettina, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I do try and provide space for students to practice their facilitation skills. A lot of the issues we discuss in my classroom when it comes to citizenship are often quite difficult issues. There's discussion about, how race structures citizenship, sexuality, class, gender, and the discussions often become quite uncomfortable, and there's a lot of discomfort in the classroom. And so what I'm really grappling with at the moment is how to teach students, to facilitate these discussions that produce discomfort and that produce tension in the classroom. So I'm really beginning to become very interested in sort of pedagogies that deal or address discomfort in a space. The students are very keen to discuss these tension-filled issues and these uncomfortable issues. And so there's always a lot of discussion, but these are discussions that are not often easy to facilitate. So I find myself often stepping in when the discussions go off the rails. So I'm still really struggling and grappling with that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks for those observations. So there's another question here on conversations about social justice. I mean, so this is more about the content of the conversations versus the process. And, maybe it's not either or, but in terms of the practice of, as you just said, Bettina, some of the conversations are difficult. When you talk about race and racism, how do Patty's asking, an issue that's come up was around this idea of full participation. So what does it mean to have voice? And when historically voice has been given to particular groups of population and have a particular bias, what is your thought about, also in the mix, the critique, tyranny of full participation? So that's an interesting concept. Who would like to weigh in on that?
Bettina, you want to jump first?
Okay, go ahead, Bettina.
I think everybody on this call is most probably grappling with that question. So I'm in a program where there's a lot of work that we do with students around positionality, reflexivity. Our students go on 8-month placements to other parts of the world where they're often in very different cultural settings. So our students who really grapple with issues around positionality. I tend to keep participation in the classroom very open, but also, really, I think I'm quite conscious about building in spaces, for students to reflect on their own positionality in pairs. But I think spaces for reflecting on positionality need to be structured into the discussion space in the classroom. So I'm really grappling with, at the moment, on how to structure reflexivity into the participatory process in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Great. Tim,
if I could just add a little bit there, and I'm cheating, so I hope I'm not throwing the system off, but I'm also seeing the comments on the side, and if I can partially respond to that question from Patty about social justice, also with David's about the difficult discussions there at the bottom. Because I didn't say this maybe as explicitly, but I think it's essential and critical, right? How do we think about developing kind of this civic mindset that attends to things like, right, checking one's privilege? How are we listening across kind of the differences of power? Who has agency and doesn't, in named or unnamed ways? which is partly why I pointed to that rubric, for example, because like something like empathy, for example, shows up on there. And how do we think of what does it mean to mature in our understanding of being empathetic towards others, especially when we're stepping into a role of trying to facilitate conversation with a whole bunch of people, presumably rather diverse in ideology and perspective and experience, unless we're doing kind of an enclave conversation, which is maybe slightly different, but probably some of the same principles would stand. But how do you do that in a way that's not just this mechanical of like, all right, now I need to do the introduction, now I need to move through the sequence of discrete conversation topics. A big piece of this really is deeply, I think, developmental. And partly that last slide that I pointed to, I was talking about civic professionals, but the element that I didn't say there was also how do we think about preparing young people, students, to think of themselves through that lens, right? This is where, like Harry Boyd, for example, uses the language of public work, right? How do we think about our roles in whatever professional capacities or social roles we might have? How do we utilize the expertise that we have in these public regarding ways, to quote a Bill Sullivan article from a number of years ago. But I think it's those tensions that then lead us back to the original question about social justice, because this is one of those kind of wrestling tensions, especially if you're training people to facilitate dialogue or deliberation in these neutral ways. It gets sometimes challenging when you want to be maybe more explicitly advocating for particular concerns for marginalized groups, or creating space for those people, in fact, to speak for themselves or to engage in ways that really would be most democratic, but for all sorts of reasons, they may choose to be silent or feel they can't speak, those types of things. So yeah, for me, all of that is wrapped up in these kinds of conversations. And that's the part that makes this difficult, because that takes a long time, right? So it's difficult to put that into a term-long class, for example. How do you build up enough understanding and experience and, frankly, some maturity in short time frames? And so this is, I think, a big reason lots of centers and institutes have created opportunities and programs that transcend the limitations of a quarter or a semester, and really invite students to be collaborators and peers in not only doing that work immediately then, but also in whatever roles they might step into in the future, taking some of those skills and habits, and I mean, democratic habits, into the places where they will show up later in life. And so that's a big part that drives much of this for me. And I'm sorry if I didn't say that as explicitly earlier, because I think that's a central question. But the social justice issue, I wrote about, so I won't explain more here, but in an essay called The Politics of Knowledge. And I think there are lots of layers that are all nested that until we start to unpack some of those things, we're really coming up short.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks for commenting. And also we sort of dipped down into David Kahane's comment about, building student capacity and some of the things that can be done that should be beyond facilitation techniques, but really just creating that kind of learning space, or creating the container for dialogue. And I just want to zip up here to the question that Elisa has asked around the use of ICT, which I had to clarify that is information and communications technology. I probably should know that, but you see, you have to check your assumptions. So do you want to talk, Bettina, you mentioned you're doing these Zoom dialogues. It's an interesting example of how you're bringing technology. Any other ways? This person, Elisa, is talking about she's studying these kinds of issues in the context of Cuba. So there probably are some technology, some constraints as well for the use of technology. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, I'll just say something more about the global classroom that we are developing. So we are really learning from South African colleagues about how to structure and run these global classrooms. So they've been experimenting for a very long time with other universities in Southern Africa on how to combine classrooms, but not only combining classrooms, how to facilitate meaningful dialogues between students who come from very different contexts. A student from Zimbabwe actually has a very different experience from a student in South Africa. And so they use, so it's not only about using, technology that can bring students together, but it's also thinking about how to bring together the right technology with sort of thoughtful and reflective facilitation and dialogical practices in an online environment. And so the next global classroom we're having is actually being led by the South Africans, facilitated by the South Africans. They've structured the agenda. And I have to say, we are learning an enormous amount. So I think, there's real potential for Northern academics to learn a lot about how to use technology in a democratic classroom from academics in the Global South, where a lot of this work is really being done and deepened quite rapidly.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're saying it's not just the technology, but it's the way that you're inviting people in to shape the conversation, and that in itself is a kind of a social technology that needs to be attended to.
Yes. Yeah, and maybe just a little quick add there too is that in some of the use of technology in these spaces for me is that it also affords opportunities that some people are more inclined, even when we're thinking more broadly, just pedagogically, that some who are not apt to immediately jump into a conversation just by invitation and being in a space might be a little bit more inclined to be more methodical and reflective and writing out or typing out something like that. So some of these platforms that exist, the Common Ground for Action, for example, which uses the National Issues Forums Institute framework for deliberation, is a text-based platform that's online. People can be anywhere, but it's a different experience at getting at a common kind of theme and topic. And so the question of technology really is an important one. Platforms like Text Talk Act, for example, utilize a smartphone and turn that into a facilitator for small group discussion around mental health or voter registration or elections. The National Institute for Civil Discourse has really championed that, and Matt Leiniger helped to develop that around mental health here in the United States a number of years ago. So the use of technology, I think, is a tremendous asset. It just then begs the question of, to what end are you doing that, and what are you trying to accomplish it, and what does it help you succeed at that might otherwise not be afforded to you?
Mm-hmm. And I'm just aware that we've got about 8 more minutes, so I just want to get to a couple of more questions. One is around this idea of tools. What Stephen Buckley asks, what tools are being used to measure the degree to which participants feel they're being heard? And then I think the other one, which is really very relevant to our conversation today too, is around the role of, the capacity of teachers themselves to do this work, because we seem to be focusing on how do we do this work with our students or in the classrooms that we work in, but part of it is the capacity building of our own colleagues, and that is certainly I think something that we need to pay attention to. So maybe one of you could take the question around, the evaluation question, and others around the capacity building of future teachers before we simply run out of time. And there is a question too from Jeremy about resources beyond the text that we've cited. And as I mentioned I typed into everyone, these slides will be shared with all of you. And if you have other questions, I'm sure people would be willing to provide resources, and even on this chat we can provide some links if you like. So the question around evaluation, who would like to weigh in on that? How do you know that you've managed to engage?
One short way in the Pedagogy book, we actually have a whole section on assessment in a variety of ways. So some of it coming at issues of some textual analysis of, like, looking at transcripts, for example, of these deliberations. Part of the assessment, actually, that rubric that I pointed to, is a really helpful way, right? I mean, how do we move beyond just saying like, oh yeah, that went well, or that was good, those kinds of things, to really thinking about that individual kind of developmental thinking. So that's a reference that the larger chapter in which that rubric was embedded is a tremendous thing that I have found just really to be helpful. This is one of those issues, though, of depending on how you want to think about evaluation and assessment, If it's if you're going in kind of a quantitative way, then some of this becomes a little bit more difficult. But if you're looking at it in a more kind of humanistic, qualitative way, I think there becomes a lot of opportunities to think about the impacts of this work beyond saying, did that go well, or did you enjoy yourself? Because as Bettina noted, sometimes these issues are really, really hot, they're really sensitive, and so not everybody's going to be walking out feeling wonderful about what just occurred, but nevertheless, it's still significant and impactful. So being able to navigate some of that, so not just do you give a thumbs up to what just happened, moving from that kind of evaluation to these more substantive opportunities, and getting at, as I pointed to, not to only emphasize that one, but I think partly why that showed up here was because we started looking at some of the literature around this and realizing it was kind of thin from the evaluation kind of assessment standpoint, particularly for the deliberative pedagogy approach that I was talking about. So I'll end there if Bettina wants to add as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, you know, in my center in Toronto, we're relying on student evaluations, but I was just struck by David Kahane's point in the chat box. You know, that, I mean, what we're also trying to do in a classroom in which the aim is to deepen experiences of democratic citizenship is to really build the capacity to act in more empathic, more reflective ways. And so what we're wanting to introduce alongside student evaluations are sort of post-course spaces and opportunities for students to dialogue how they might have felt changed as in terms of their own experiences of citizenship by the classroom experience. So to complement student evaluations with more reflective spaces for students to come together at the end of a class to reflect on, you know, how they feel their own capacities for citizenship were either deepened or weakened, sometimes weakened by the classroom experience.
Great.
So and this is the beauty of having the bookshelf behind you, is that, and I just put it in the chat box, but this really thin volume was a follow-up study, a 10-year study after an experience that some professors at Wake Forest University in North Carolina here in the US did. And so the follow-up was called the long-term impact of learning to deliberate. And what they found, actually using quantitative measures, so if you're looking for that kind of data, this is one of those few studies that's out there. 10 years out, students who went through this deliberative process, in contrast to students who didn't and otherwise did the same program, had significantly more impactful experiences that this work has reverberated in the settings that they've gone into, whether it's been into law, into other professional kind of roles. And so I think we've got some of these kind of examples that are really, really helpful in basically answering the question, why invest the time and the resources, energy into some of this work. And there was a second question other than the evaluation.
Yeah, the other question is from
the professional
RW. I'm not sure W, but about the concern around future teachers, how to use the language and have literate interactions with their future classrooms at a developmental level. So, you know, what is the right content and level for what age group? You know, that sounds like a fairly complex question. In the last 2 minutes of our webinar, I'm not sure that we can really address that adequately, but
a really short version of a response is we've instituted something called our Civic Engagement Fellows here, and it's particularly through this deliberative dialogic lens. So we're asking our faculty from across all sorts of disciplines, we're a big research university, to say, what would it look like if your community engagement was done through this kind of approach? And so we've created a lot of resources and materials, and I could share some of these with you, Joanna, and we could disseminate some of that's helpful.
That sounds great. Yeah, and I see, Patty, you've included reference to a journal article that might be helpful. I think this is around, it's the issue of partnerships examines the challenge of teaching democratic thinking. So that might be a complementary resource there too. And Pat Scully, who is our managing director for Participedia, is on the call and mentions that there is a teaching, training, and learning repository. I was going to mention that. And some great resources from different faculty, from some of our partner organizations and researchers who are teaching participation and have actually their curriculum resources available for you to take a look at. So that's a really helpful, and that's also on the Participedia website. And then Patty, Patty is a font of information here, talking about a journal devoted to teaching democratic thinking. She was referencing I think the earlier reference that she has posted. I'm going to now bring this session to a close. 1 hour is obviously not adequate. It's just really getting us started on this conversation. But I want to thank both Tim and Bettina for really such complimentary presentations. I think that both you laid out, Tim, I think a great framework for thinking about the way we teach and what we teach when we're talking about democratic participation. And then Bettina talking about citizenship and reminding us of the multiple dimensions that we need to consider. And when we talk about the Global South, those lessons very much have, I think, resonance and importance application here in the Global North, where we do not have equality within experiences of students coming into our classrooms, and we need to pay attention to our own positionality and also those who of students who may feel like they have greater privilege and power. There is a power imbalance often within our own classrooms that we need to manage, and it's complex. So I'd like to just leave you with a couple of things. First of all, to let you know that we're following up this session with another session October 31st. Tim, you mentioned Matt Langinger's work with Public Agenda. He will be joining us along with Julian Landry from St. Francis Xavier Coady International Institute. And they will be talking about their insights into working with seasoned and mid-career professionals from the public sector NGOs and what it means to coach and mentor professionals in the use and research of public participation. Certainly think that has a lot of application for those of us that work in higher education and working with colleagues who want to bring this work into their classrooms but are completely unprepared in their own experience of teaching to do so, but have an interest and an openness to learning. So please join us or let people know about the October 31st session. And just in closing, I've got one more slide just about follow-up. So as I said, slides and video will be available to all of you who participated. If you have specific questions, you want to get in touch, info@participedia.net. And please do take a look at the website if you haven't already, Participedia XYZ. It's our new format. We're really thrilled with the way it looks and the way the information is communicated. Excellent work. Jesse Carlson on this, who's managing behind the scenes, has had a big part in that, and we're really appreciative of that work. Henry Giraud has written Why Universities Must Defend Democracy, and I just want to end with this quote. He says that colleges and universities must define themselves anew as a public good, a protective space for the promotion of democratic ideals, of the social imagination, civic values, and a critically engaged citizenship. We must educate our students to become intelligent, compassionate, critically engaged adults, fully aware of the fact that without informed citizens, there is no democracy. So I really congratulate all of you on the work that you're doing and really appreciate you coming onto the call today and taking the time to think with us about these important questions. I hope we'll be able to connect again soon. So thank you and have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.